is building a culture of feedback. Changing culture is hard, and then team members need to be able to both give and receive feedback, praise, and criticism along the way to navigate the challenges successfully. Teams that avoid conflict, don't share feedback, and don't take time to meaningfully appreciate one another will plateau in their change efforts at best. That's why we've chosen to focus on this topic so prominently. Secondly, monitoring and supporting staff well-being is a critical component of a strength-based culture. In Strong Orgs Part 2, we'll revisit the PERMA well-being framework, take a pulse check of your team's well-being, and share strategies and tools for boosting, measuring, and supporting well-being across your organization through strengths. Ultimately, it is important to remember that these two components go hand in hand. A strong culture of feedback supports workplace well being because it creates a space for people to be honest, have conversations that are honest about what's going on well and what could be done better in terms of well being. And practicing radical candor, which we'll be diving into in a minute, is going to be a huge tool for us to be able to achieve these goals. So as for today, here's what we have on tap. We've been through the intro and the agenda. I'm going to take a deep dive into radical candor, about 70 minutes. Then we're going to talk about an introduction to SBI, which is a feedback framework that we use. And then we're going to jump into what our assignments are going to be for next week, and then ultimately do our session evaluations. So let's get to it. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to send everybody back into breakout rooms. But before I jump into that, let's do a little bit of framing. So in strong teams, we spend time diving into how strengths can be used to both strengthen relationships and to navigate challenging ones. In terms of strengthening relationships, we explored how strength spotting could create this ripple effect of positive emotion throughout an organization. We also discussed how recognizing and leveraging strength synergies can lead to some of the most amazing dynamic duos like Batman and Robin and Sonny and Cher, and clearly LeBron James and Anthony Davis. On the flip side, we also explored how strengths can be used to navigate relationship challenges. We explored strengths overuse and underuse and how over and underuse can lead to strengths collisions. Finally, we introduced the STOP method as a way to navigate challenging relationships through a strength based lens. Whether strengths are being used to boost a relationship or deal with hard ones, one thing is consistently true: a culture of feedback is essential. So, we're going to begin this session by reflecting on our own experience with feedback. And please note that when we refer to feedback, we're not only talking about that hard, like high stakes, nerve wracking, critical conversation that seemingly takes years off of our lives, where we're like thinking about, okay, what am I going to say to this person that ultimately is negative feedback that just stresses us out. We think of feedback as both sharing meaningful and authentic praise, as well as clear and kind criticism consistently and clearly. So, in that vein, we're going to move everybody into breakout rooms to discuss the prompts on this screen, which is: what is the most meaningful feedback that you have ever received? Who gave it? How did they share it? And why was it meaningful? So we're going to send everybody into breakout rooms. It'll be breakout rooms of 3. It'll be about an 8-minute session. And then as a debrief, we're going to ask 2 or 3 people to share specifically why the feedback they shared was meaningful. So if everybody can join your meeting rooms, your breakout rooms.
I know Julie stepped away for a second.
Okay.
Do you see that Nick is in the waiting room, Maya?
Yes.
Been trying to let him in, but he's not joining, so he may have stepped away as well.
I sent him a message in the waiting room to ask if he was good, but he hadn't sent it back yet.
Oh, I see that.
Alan and Anita, have you guys received your invitation to your breakout room?
No.
You guys are in the same breakout room, so let me send y'all to one.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
I'm going to break out room 7 because Sherry just asked for help, so I'll be back.
Okay.
It's like we're in outer space, going to another portal.
I know, it's just weird.
I don't know why that made me think of the Age of Aquarius.
The song.
Yeah.
Do you think that's what's happening?
I said that song. I mean, that statement that Joe said made me think of the song, The Age
Yeah.
of Aquarius.
I know, the dawning. It could be.
True. But we've been here before. If you look at American history,
Yeah.
we've I can't say we made it always unscathed, but
Right. We've had a few rocky roads along the way.
yeah,
Oh,
that's hope.
funny time. I don't even know. I don't even know.
So funny movie that I think everybody should watch is Borat. Have you seen the new Borat?
Yeah.
Have you seen it, Janice?
Yes. Yes, of course.
Let's talk about it after this is over.
Yeah.
Because I think the mics are hot, but back. So how was that conversation? Vic, I really like your background. I just saw your Halloween style background. That's pretty awesome.
Thank you. I had a virtual house party for Breakthrough last night, actually.
Oh.
And I cannot figure out how to turn it off while I'm in the midst of a call. So
Got
you guys are welcome.
Got it. Thank you. So while we're talking, did you want to share the most meaningful feedback that you have received?
Sure. I was telling my group I can share it now because it will be public, but I was recently promoted to development director at Mortar.
Okay.
And the most meaningful feedback that I received was from my predecessor, Derek Brazil, who helped establish Mortar. He's one of our founders. We were on the phone, so he shared it verbally. He just stated that he felt like he was leaving the organization in good hands. And that meant the world to me because I know how this is his baby, right? Like I work here and I care very much, but it's not my baby. It's like a little cousin or something. So for Derek to feel like he could leave and go chase his other dreams and know that his baby would be okay in my hands meant a lot to me.
Yeah, that's a huge compliment to you and the organization. So yeah, I guess was that a no pressure comment also?
Yeah, no, it was totally just like, that thing is yours. Have at it. I'm out.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Does anybody else want to share some of the most meaningful feedback that they have ever received?
Philip, I'll take a shot at it. As I share with our group, most meaningful comment or feedback I got was really from my older brother. He was 17, I was 15 at the time. Was probably, now as I look back, it was about 3 months before he passed away. But he looked me in the eye, he said, "Kurt, you have a lot of book sense, but you don't have a lot of common sense." And knowing it was coming from my older brother, it meant a lot because he wanted to do the best for me. And the reason I think it's meaningful is because it makes me think more about, I don't need to be the smartest person in the room. That it's okay to rely on others and and secure their input and guidance, because that's always helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And when it came across originally, how did it make you feel? Were you like,
Well, initially you push back and you say to yourself, common sense is not all it's cracked up to be. But then when you think about it, you think to yourself, yeah, if you're going to get along in this world, you've got to, I think, we now call it street smarts or and be able to, interact and interface with people as opposed to just basically saying, well, these are the rules, this is what you have to work with, and this is where you go. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Kurt, I really appreciate you sharing that. I mean, that sounds very, very personal. And actually allows me to think about, while all the examples that we share feel very unique to us, there's likely a couple of things that they all consistently have in common. And the first thing is that the person who shared the feedback likely cared about you as a person, or at least they cared about your success. And then also your relationship with that person beyond the feedback moment probably played a big role in your sense that they care about you. The second thing is that the feedback that you shared was delivered in a way that was clear, and it helped you either understand something important or taking action on the thing that you needed to take. So as we dive into Radical Candor Framework, keep those two elements in mind and assess the examples that were just shared through the lens of Radical Candor. So most people agree that feedback is important. So let's take a look at a couple of data points that illustrate this. So in the chat, I want everybody to jump into the chat and I want you to answer the first question. What percentage of people do you think agree that critical feedback is effective at improving performance? Jump into the chat and you can just say, I think it's 5% of individuals agree that critical feedback is effective.
We got 30%, 95, 90, 75, 61%, 90, 80, a lot of 90s, 60, 84, 60, 85, 75.
Okay.
So we got about a 60 to 90 range percent.
About a 60 to 90 range. So in a study by Zinger and Folkman, 94% of survey respondents agreed that critical feedback is effective at improving performance. So letting people know how they can improve their work can make them better at their jobs. That makes sense. So again, let's jump right back into the chat. And I want to ask you the second question. What percentage of people do you think say they would work harder if they felt their efforts were better recognized? You can jump into the chat. And again, just tell me what you think.
We got 50%, 82, 85, 100%, 80, 87, 92, 60, 99, 85, 80, 91.75%. Love how Aaron is like so precise.
Right. Because he was 61.25 the first question.
Yep.
All righty. So in another study, nearly 70% of survey respondents said that they would work harder if they felt their efforts were better recognized. So letting people know when they're doing good work is a critical component of feedback. In fact, several studies suggest that meaningful praise actually has a greater impact on employee performance than criticism. I'm going to say that again. Several studies suggest that meaningful praise actually has a much greater impact on employee performance than criticism. Remember the 5-to-1 rule we shared in our very first session. It takes 5 positive comments and or interactions to outweigh the impact of just one negative comment or interaction. Keep this in mind when it comes to building a feedback culture. All right, so we're going to go on to the next page. So again, just to wrap this one up, 94% of people agree that critical feedback is effective at improving performance, and then 69%, or just about 70% of people said that they would work harder if they felt that their efforts were better recognized. So now we're going to do this again. I want you to jump right back into the chat because I want to talk about the disconnect that may exist when it comes to feedback. So again, let's jump right back into the chat and I want you to answer the question. The percentage of leaders that have rated themselves as highly effective at providing others with honest, straightforward feedback. Just write it in the chat.
25, 80%, they're coming in fast. 87, 90%, 40%. 12, 55, 75, 40, 60. A lot of 40s and 60s.
A lot of
10,
40s and 60s. Okay.
75.
All right. So here's the thing. 62% or more than half of leaders rate themselves as highly effective at providing others with honest, straightforward feedback, right? And so now I want you to say, I want everybody to jump back into the chat. We're going to stay in the chat for a little while. And I want you to say, what is the percentage of employees who say they have not received any useful feedback in the past 6 months?
80, 79, 90, 75, 80, 75, 87, 110, 75, 90, 85,
Okay.
85.
Okay. So the answer is 60% of employees say that they have not received any useful feedback in the past 6 months. So here's the bottom line. So while many of us think that we are doing a good job at sharing feedback, the reality is that most of us could be doing a much better job. If over half of employees who work for managers who think that they're giving effective feedback are not feeling like they're receiving good feedback, there's clearly a disconnect in either the way that that feedback is delivered or the way that a person is receiving the information. And so let's talk about the common feedback strategies. How many people, and you can raise your hand on this. You don't have to raise your hand, but you could raise your hand on this. But how many people have used the sandwich approach to give feedback? Does anybody remember the sandwich approach? I always call it the poop sandwich. Basically, you start with like this one positive thing, right? And then you share the feedback that you actually want to give. And then you end it off and tidy things up with like this other positive thing. It usually comes across as like really nice in theory, but ultimately it's just confusing because the person doesn't know if you're like trying to be nice to them or if you're trying to correct them or whatever. At the end of the day, the sandwich, the poop sandwich stinks. I don't even know how we started to do this. The next thing is the feedback volcano. And that's when you have the person, and I've been this person before, where you don't say anything and it just bubbles underneath the surface until one day you're in a meeting and then everything blows up. And all of the things that have been an issue for this person all of this time ends up everywhere. They start talking about things that you did 2 or 3 years ago. This could be personally and or professionally, but we're talking about personal today. We're talking about professional today. And then lastly, I've also been this person where you don't say anything at all. You just back away and you avoid giving feedback, good, bad, or indifferent altogether. So I can honestly say that I've done all of these techniques. And I'm here to tell you that there is definitely a better way. So the question is, what is this better way for sharing feedback? And we are going to call it radical candor. We're not going to call it radical candor. Kim Scott calls it radical candor. In her book, Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity, we talk about the ways that you can give great feedback. So I want to start this off with a poll. I want to make this as interactive as possible. So we're going to start this off with a poll, and I want you to be able to answer, what are the 2 core principles behind radical candor? So just answer the poll.
All right, got a few people answering now.
Mm-hmm. Got a few people left to vote. But it seems like we may have a runaway victor.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I want to end polling in 3 seconds. 2, 1. All right, we're going to share results. All right, so most of us got this right. 83% of us said that caring personally and challenging directly is what radical candor ultimately stands for, or the key principles behind radical candor. It's pretty simple, right? The first part is caring personally, where you're bringing your whole self to work and you caring about the people who work with you as a human being. The second part is challenging directly, where you're giving guidance to the people you work with and letting them know when their work isn't good enough, and this is huge, and when the work is good. So when this exists, what it does is it creates a culture where you can accept and act on both praise and criticism. You can begin to share honest praise and criticism with one another. Everybody begins to embrace their role because they're clear on where it is that they stand and what is to be expected. And then we can focus on the results for that specific team. So the last point about this, and this is specifically about getting results, is that getting results isn't just about the bottom line or about metrics. It's about freeing you up and your team to focus on the work that really matters. The work that matters to you, matters to your organization, and the work that matters to the community. When radical candor does not exist in an organization, it oftentimes means that people have to spend lots of time avoiding conflict, navigating politics, and ultimately end up spinning their wheels. So, why does people consider this radical? All of it sounds easy for you to like care personally about people and to be able to challenge directly, but it's not. It's not easy, and this is the reason that they call it radical. It's radical because it's against the way that many of us operate. That's because the idea of radical candor challenges the messages and the expectations we often have internalized from a very young age. Many of us were taught this: if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all, right? And then what happens is as we get older, that easily manifests itself into an avoidance of sharing tough feedback and challenging directly because we're afraid of hurting other people or causing conflict. But in reality, not sharing tough feedback with someone is the thing that can be the most painful. Sharing tough feedback in a way that is both kind and clear is the humane, productive, and supportive thing to do. In addition, when we enter the world of work, we frequently get these messages, both explicit and implicit, about acting professionally, which often means being polite, but not bringing your full self into your work or truly getting to know the people around us. Cultural expectations also influence the way that people navigate professionalism. In reality, we're all human beings with human feelings, and even at work, we need to be seen as such. We have to repress who we are to earn a living. We often become alienated. And when people don't feel like we give a damn about them, beyond their ability to contribute to results, we alienate others. The good news is that focusing on building a strength-based culture can help create a culture of caring personally and challenging directly. And we'll dive into that in a little bit. So what are the alternatives to radical candor? So as we think about radical candor, there are like 4 different quadrants in which people can fall, right? And so everybody doesn't live at radical candor all day, every day. So this is just an illustration of one, when people care personally, there's on that y-axis where you can care personally, and then also the x-axis of challenging directly. So you could fall into ruinous empathy, right? And that's where you care personally, but you do not challenge directly. Or you could fall into manipulative insincerity, where you do not care personally and you do not challenge directly. Or you could fall into the obnoxious aggression, where you challenge directly, but you do not care personally. And finally, you could live in radical candor. Well, nobody really lives in radical candor, but it's ultimately where you care personally and challenge directly. So to be honest, this is all about behavior. This is not about personality. People exhibit ruinously empathetic behaviors, but they are not ruinously empathetic people. And that's important for you to remember in all of this, is that I don't want you, as we're going through this process of looking at radical candor, to think about yourself as being manipulatively insincere. It is just a behavior that you have used as a coping mechanism, or even as a way just to be able to deliver feedback up to this point. Now, what I want to be able to show you is how you can move towards this radical candid space more often. So again, we're going to jump into a poll, but let's start off with ruinous empathy. So ruinous empathy is when you care, but you don't challenge. So it ultimately comes across as that praise that isn't specific or criticisms that is sugar coated and unclear. Lots of times that ends up being that poop sandwich. Also, why does it happen? It usually happens to avoid the tension or discomfort at work where people are worried about hurting other people's feelings. I remember I used to be the king of ruinous empathy. I had a team of people. This is when I first became a manager. Um, and I wanted to be nice. I wanted to be light. And there were times where I was supposed to give really specific feedback, good or bad, and I would send it through an email. And the email became just like this soup of large words that should have just been like, you did a really good job on this and I really appreciate it, and here's the impact that you have, right? But instead it ended up being like these really, like in the dictionary of just really large words that didn't say anything, and the person just walked away confused. So this is what I want you to do. We're going to launch a poll, and I want you to be able to answer which is not an example of ruinous empathy. Which is not an example. Is non-specific praise, like good job, an example? Criticism that avoids the real issue? Screaming at someone in front of the team, an example? Or the feedback sandwich, is that an example? Remember, we are asking what is not an example of ruinous empathy. I'm gonna give you about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm gonna end polling now. So to share these results, so the right answer is that screaming at someone in front of the team to make an example is not an example of ruinous empathy. That's actually an example of obnoxious aggression, which we'll get to in a minute. But to go a little further on this, the main thing to remember about ruinous empathy is that ruinous empathy is about a focus on other people. You're worried about hurting other people's feelings or creating discomfort. Oftentimes, it happens because we think that we are being nice. According to Kim Scott, about 75% of feedback mistakes happens in this quadrant. All right, so let's jump into manipulative insincerity. Manipulative insincerity. I cannot say that 5 times fast. What is it? When you neither care nor challenge directly. And then this comes across as praise that is non-specific and insincere, or criticism that is neither clear nor kind. Why does this happen? You are too focused on being liked. You attempt to gain some sort of political advantage by being fake, or you're just too tired to care or argue about it anymore. So we're going to launch another poll, and we're going to ask the question, which of the following is not an example of manipulative insincerity? Remember, we're asking which of the following is not an example of manipulative insincerity. We got about 15 folks that are jumping in. Manipulative sincerity, again, is when you do not care personally and you do not challenge directly. All right. 5 seconds. All right, I'm going to end polling and share the results. So manipulative insincerity, looks like the group, 58% of the group said that backstabbing is not manipulative insincerity, but in actuality, it is. What is not considered to be manipulative insincerity is taking it easy on someone by just not sharing feedback with them.
Hey Phil, could I jump in real quick?
Yes,
Because I
please.
wrote this question actually, and it might be a little bit confusing. So
Uh-huh.
so backstabbing, the reason why backstabbing actually is a form of manipulative insincerity is you might be telling someone something they want to hear and going behind their back. Anytime you're talking about someone and not to them, that's a form of manipulative insincerity. The difference would be when we get to obnoxious aggression. Obnoxious aggression would be more like front stabbing, like you're very blatantly doing something to hurt someone. But if you're kind of going behind the scenes, that's manipulative insincerity. And then the key difference with taking it easy on someone by just not sharing feedback with them, that's more of a focus. You're worried about other people's feelings. You don't want to hurt their feelings. Manipulative insincerity is all about protecting yourself.
Yeah.
So you're doing something to benefit yourself or to give yourself an advantage.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. So while you're on, Joe, can you give us an example of a time when you were manipulatively insincere?
I've never done that. I have no examples. Yeah, one quick example is several years ago, I was in a new leadership role, overseeing new teachers, and there was a particular teacher in this group that really needed to go for some really concerning performance reasons. But this person was also well liked and well known by the rest of the group, and I wanted to make sure when I was starting out in this new job that everyone liked me. That seemed like a really important thing at the time. So rather than being clear about the decision, I let it drag on and on and on because I wanted to find a way to, make this tough call while also maintaining, the support and the admiration of everyone else in this particular group. And what ended up happening is it turned into a big mess unnecessarily. Whereas if I would have been kind and clear from the beginning, we would have avoided a lot of issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Joe. Thanks. So really the bottom line with manipulative insincerity is that it's all about you, right? You're preserving your own feelings and your self-interest. As Joe was just talking about, he wanted to be liked. If you're talking about someone and not to someone, you're probably operating in manipulative insincerity. All right. So next one. Obnoxious aggression, one of my personal favorites. What is it? Obnoxious aggression is when you challenge, but you don't care. You praise and it doesn't feel sincere, or the criticism that isn't delivered kindly. Why does it happen? It usually happens because of insecurity, lack of empathy, a desire to command. It's like old school model of authority where it's like command and control. So what I want to do, we're gonna open up the last poll. And this one is, which of the following is not an example of obnoxious aggression? Not an example. So is command and control approach in management obnoxious aggression? Is saying talk to the hand an example of obnoxious aggression? Is discouraging the sharing of praise obnoxious aggression? Is embarrassing people in front of others an example of obnoxious aggression? This is a tough one because there's a couple in here that potentially could be not examples of obnoxious aggression. So this one might throw people for a loop. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds. You got like 3-4 people that are still kind of hanging out there. All right. I'm going to end polling and share the results. So it's interesting. So as you can see, I'm currently sharing the results, and 71% of us said discouraging the sharing of praise is considered to be obnoxious aggression. And while that potentially could be an example of obnoxious aggression, the right answer in this one is saying talk to the hand. Now, I would actually I'm going to ask Joe to kind of like explain why talking to the hand is not an example of obnoxious aggression.
Clearly, I'm not an SAT question writer because these are a little bit confusing, I think, now that I'm reading them again. But I was honestly just trying to be a little bit funny. Like, I think if someone actually says talk to the hand, that's more funny than obnoxiously aggressive. But on the discouraging the sharing of praise, if you are a leader who really hammers home this belief that people don't deserve acknowledgement because it's just their job, and you actively discourage praise, that is a form of obnoxious aggression because you're discouraging that feedback from being shared. But admittedly, I understand why that was a bit of a confusing question.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Joe. So while obnoxious aggression can be overly simplified as being just plain mean, the reality is it's actually the second best option among these four quadrants behind radical candor. Kim Scott explains this because obnoxiously aggressive feedback is at least clear. People know where they stand. Now, over time, relying on obnoxious aggression will likely mean you're going to be burning through people in your organization, and the people who do stick around might resent you or their jobs. But hey, at least you're being clear. So I'm going to actually call on Janice to share an example of a time where she was being obnoxiously aggressive.
Thank you so much. So it's a fond and scary memory from way back. And it really started in manipulative insincerity in that I was a people pleaser because I wanted to be liked and I had a team up in New York of merchants when I was working for Macy's, and they're really tough people. They demand perfection, and they don't do it kindly often. And I just wanted to please them because I didn't want the stuff to fall down to me. I didn't want them to tell on me to their bosses and it would come rippling back. And I had to deliver some important things for them in their offices in New York. And so I kept saying, yes, I can do it. Sure, I can do it. Yeah, I can make it happen. Knowing that the deadline they were asking for was pretty much impossible and that there were better ways to manage that by just saying, look, is there some flexibility? Could I deliver it to you, 10 o'clock in the morning rather than 6 o'clock the night before? I didn't negotiate any of that. I just sort of said, yes, I can do it. Yes, I can do it. And then when it didn't happen exactly as they thought it should happen, and they were calling me at 5 o'clock in the evening, and actually it had been delivered, they just hadn't been able to find the merchandise I was trying to get to them, I blew up. So all of a sudden I became that volcano of anger and rage, and may have even sort of let go a little F-bomb. I mean, I'm embarrassed. My team wants me to report that I actually let go an F-bomb. I might have, I don't know, foggy memory. But the truth is it was not good. It was not pretty. They did know what I was saying. And actually the next morning they apologized to me, but I was horrible. And I was literally risking my career because I had let it get that bad. And I had all along, no empathy for them. All I wanted to do was look like the winner. And then it pent up and then it exploded. And I was obnoxiously aggressive, and I don't recommend it to anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Another example of an obnoxious aggressive person is Bobby Knight, old school basketball coach from Indiana basketball. Clearly he was consistently obnoxiously aggressive, and his players either loved him a lot because they knew where they stood, or they hated him altogether because he was just completely obnoxious and aggressive. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a little bit of a scenario. So now that we have explored the model further, this is what we want to talk about. So in the chat, I want you to share what you would do if a coworker walked into the room with a big chunk of food in his or her teeth. What do you do? What do you do if a coworker walks into the room and they got some spinach in their teeth? D-Kid says, I just tell them. Morgan's like, I just tell them. David, tell them. Tell them discreetly.
They're all saying tell them.
Okay. Say something. I guess maybe the question is like, how do you say it?
We do have a take a pic, then point and laugh.
Yeah.
That's my favorite so far.
Discreetly, Elena said discreetly.
Discreetly say something. All right. Well, this seems pretty consistent that everybody's going to live in the radical candor space of this. But here's how this ultimately can show up in the 4 different quadrants. The first thing, under ruinous empathy, you say nothing because you're worried about hurting the other person's feelings, and maybe they'll notice it themselves. Or in the second, manipulative insincerity, you say nothing because you're worried about your own feelings of being judged or not being liked. And then under obnoxious aggression, you could potentially just be plain mean and say, hey, everybody, look like somebody forgot to floss today, right? And you just blow them up in front of everybody else. Or using radical candor, you whisper quietly to the other person, hey, I think that you got something in your teeth. I always appreciate it when somebody tells me, and I hope that you don't mind. So this is how radical candor and also all of the other types of feedback kind of show up for folks. So let's go into a discussion. We're going to do a 3-person breakout room for the next 8 minutes, and we're going to talk about radical candor. The first question, though, is that I want you to take a moment to reflect on where you tend to fall the most often. And remember, none of us lives in radical candor 100% of the time. And so let's take a poll for this first question. In which quadrant do you tend to fall the most? Are we good on a poll for this one? If not, we can just chat it in. Yeah, just chat it in. You don't have to be anonymous. I know that I consistently fall in either obnoxious aggression or manipulative insincerity when I'm not really feeling it. Lots of ruinous empathy. Yeah, I totally get it. Vic says their whole team is radical candor. Mortar is over there killing it. They keeping it real with each other. They care about each other.
It gets messy sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you know, for me, the spinach story and ruinous empathy for the spinach story is like, I'm worried like if for that person to think, oh my God, I had that spinach in my teeth and I just came out of a powerful meeting for an hour and a half, and make them feel so bad that they were in that meeting the whole time. So that's where you got like, you know, and then yet maybe they're going to another important meeting. So you balance all that. And if you shy away from doing it because you don't want to hurt them, then you're, you know, you think you're going to do the radical candor, but sometimes,
Yeah.
you know, it's easy to fall into ruinous empathy.
Yeah, but that's the importance of this, is that now that you know that radical candor is really about caring personally and challenging directly, it creates an opportunity for you to be able to like, to be honest without your intent being to hurt the other person's feelings. So yeah, thank you all for sharing this. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to go into 3-person breakout rooms, and I want you to be able to answer or share with the group or have a conversation about which one of your strengths are at play, either through overuse or underuse, when you show up in whatever quadrant you feel like you show up the most. When I show up in ruinous empathy, I know that I'm overusing niceness or kindness, and potentially sometimes perspective, where I'm worried about the other person's perspective. When I show up in obnoxious aggression, usually that's an overuse of my leadership, because I personally have weaponized leadership in my life. Also, is potentially is the overuse of honesty, where I'm like, you know, I'm just going to tell you like it is because it is what it is. But when I show up in radical candor, it's actually a mix. It's a synergy of perspective, honesty, and kindness, where I am thinking about the other person's, how my message will land with them, and want to make sure that I am clear with what it is that I'm saying, but that ultimately I want to be able to get the message across so that they can become a better version of themselves or not make the same mistake over and over again. So we're going to go into groups. And yeah, we're going to go into groups, and we're going to share out which of your strengths are at play, either overused or underused, when you're in whatever quadrant you seem to fall the most. just us?
I believe so.
Okay. Want to share how they show up in Radical Candor and what strengths they use when they are in Radical Candor, and potentially where they are in ruinous empathy, manipulative insincerity, or obnoxious aggression. I've heard some pretty cool stuff in the chat from the mortar team. So, I'm gonna choose someone from there to just jump
So
in
we
and
only got
talk.
about 12 people back so far. They're still coming back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We've still got rooms closing for 30 seconds.
Great, Joe. That was I know that you cared personally about me.
Very direct.
So now is everybody back? Because I want someone to share out what their conversation was like about the personal examples that they have related to Radical Candor and where they may fall in these other quadrants and what strengths they're using, overusing, underusing. I just need one person, maybe two people to share.
I can go.
Okay.
And so I think my natural instinct is obnoxious aggression.
Mhm.
And knowing that, I think I tend to overcompensate and get to ruinous empathy. And
Okay.
if you have ever seen the show like Parks and Recs, how I forget the guy's name now. He's played by Rob Lowe. He
Yeah.
breaks up with Anne, and she doesn't realize it because he was so nice in the breakup.
Yeah.
There's times I feel like I've had that conversation. Like I've told you to get better 15 different times. What do you mean you're not aware of this? Here's it's written down there. Like, well, I didn't realize that it was that important. And I'm like, I have numerous documentation, and so
Yeah.
I think sometimes my efforts of trying to be empathetic and making sure that my instinct of just saying, hey, knucklehead, you
Mhm.
are not good at
Uh-huh.
this task, in a much less friendly way ends up turning into the Chris Traeger way
Yeah.
of breaking up, and then they never actually hear what they need to because I instinctively just want to yell.
Got
And
it.
so I think that trying to be empathetic sometimes counteracts my I guess lack of personal growth and emotional maturity.
So what strength do you think that you could combine with this, either this ruinous empathy or obnoxious aggression, to bring you into Radical Candor?
It's kind of odd because I have honesty and kindness in kind of the top 4 or 5.
Mhm.
So there, I feel like I'm trying to be honest when I am saying, hey, I think it would, I'm just trying to also be kind because I don't want the honesty element of it to not be heard, but I also don't want it to come off as how I'm, how at 501 I think sometimes.
Got it. I understand what you're saying. Joe actually gives some pretty good examples of this, where kindness has potentially allowed the lack of clarity to show up in communication. And so, sometimes in those situations, and Joe, you could jump in wherever you want to on this one, but sometimes it is a thought that because we are being honest, we are not being kind. But sometimes you have to be really honest and really clear in order for you to be kind, because the next step potentially will be for that person to lose their job. And so it may be important for you to create that clarity, potentially take the emotion out of the honest delivery of the message, where you're like, I want to yell, but maybe you just need to be like, hey, you did this wrong. Here's how you do it right. Right? It's super clear. And sometimes it'll hurt their feelings, but they'll get it right, which ultimately in the long run is the kinder thing to do for everybody. Because when they're not doing it right and you tell them in a way that is kind of like nice, they continue to do it wrong and it still messes everything up.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's my take on it. Joe, do you have any insight, or Janice, or even Maya, do you have any insight on this?
No, actually, I think when Janice talks about combining and reframing in just a moment, that'll be helpful as a way to really kind of use strengths for moving towards Radical Candor.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, I've done something I usually don't do, which is make it to the break on time. So I am going to give everybody a 5-minute stretch break, or a 3-minute stretch break, for you to go grab something to drink, maybe go have a bio break, come back in 3 minutes. That'll be 10:55. And Janice will take it over and start talking about how you can leverage strengths to move more into radical candor.
And I don't like to do it, and it's kind of scary sometimes. I reframe it around my creativity strengths, which is one of my top strengths. So whenever I think about giving feedback, yes, I have to be caring. Yes, I have to be direct, but I have this opportunity then to work with this other person to brainstorm how they can solve the situation or work through the situation or find other alternative ways of approaching the issue that we're dealing with. And so it becomes a really creative, fun way for me to have a rich conversation. It drives, brings in curiosity and kindness, but I reframe it. My motivation for moving into radical candor from wherever I end up in one of the other quadrants is creativity. A lot of you guys, both in your homework from last time and what Phil was just talking about, is the whole idea of kindness. And it really is, if kindness or something like kindness is one of your top strengths, it could be humility, it could be gratitude or forgiveness. If you think about how really it is kind to give feedback, kind to everyone involved, kind to that person, because you know what, if they don't know what they're doing wrong, ultimately they can't fix it and they will never get ahead. It's also kind for your relations. It's kind for you because you'll feel better about when you do it in the right way, they'll appreciate it for what you've given them, that gift of radical candor. So, and it's also kind for the business overall, and maybe even reframe it around judgment. So let's say you're stuck in manipulative insincerity. You want to just look like you're the shining star of the organization. So you don't really give appropriate feedback in the right time and nobody knows what you're really thinking or feeling. Well, if you really put your judgment, maybe judgment is one of your top strengths, you'd see that, in fact, if you were giving radical candor feedback, the whole organization, everybody's performance would get better. And soon you'd be recognized for the guy, the gal who actually helps motivate people, who is a great leader, who drives the momentum and the progress of the organization. So while you think you're protecting yourself by not saying anything, your judgment through the lens of, let me see what really is going to help me get ahead, it might be a way of reframing it. So always think about reframing. That's your motivation. The other thing that we talk about is combining. And that's like, it's sort of that whole towing up a strength. If you know that, for me, I just said bravery is a little low and honesty is high. And so I'm a little scared that I'm going to overuse my honest when I give feedback. So sometimes I shy away from it. So for instance, I had a woman who worked for me and we'd all worked with her for a long time and she's wonderful, but she had a couple of personality, kind of just quirky little things she did, which we embraced. We were fine. Our team loved, no problem at all. But I knew that we were getting totally new leadership, out with the old, in with the new from the outside, and they might not understand her. And I didn't know, I really, really grappled with it because I didn't, how can I nicely, I don't want to be overly honest with her, but how can I figure out how to give her the feedback that maybe she would want to be at least aware of these quirks so that she could decide, does she tone them down or not? So I had to take my honesty and kind of couple it with social intelligence. That's where I'm combining two strengths to compensate for my underuse of bravery and then find this really, I also brought up a little kindness and a little humor. And we had a wonderful conversation that actually she was like, oh my God, I never realized I did that. I gave her totally the choice to, you can either stay exactly who you are because that's your authentic self, or just be aware of it and maybe tone it down a little as the new leadership gets to know you. So she was forever grateful. It was all good. Anybody, does anybody else from my team or others want to give an example of either reframing or combining? Just, chat it in, or Joe, or anybody else have an example that you like to think about for either of those?
I'll just call to attention a question that came in the chat from Tiffany, and then was seconded by Kurt about what about accepting feedback, not just sharing feedback. And I would say that and you're going to touch on this, I know, in just a moment, Janice, but I think the same model actually applies in terms of combining strengths together. And Maya shared a great example in here in terms of when you're receiving feedback, really pulling on your social intelligence and your perspective, kind of combining those two together to really understand where where that feedback is coming from, how it fits in with the bigger picture. For me, it's definitely about humility. Humility is in my top 10. And it's about, you know, I think many of us have sort of this reaction when we hear feedback of kind of like, ow, that kind of, we want to kind of defend ourselves or explain why that feedback doesn't make sense. I always have to pull on that humility to really stop, to hear it, and to process it. So it's very similar where you can bring forward certain strengths when you receive feedback, and that is as essential as sharing feedback really well. Because if someone takes a risk and shares feedback with you and it's not received well, they're in all likelihood not going to do it again. I don't want to steal more of your thunder, Janice, so I know you're going to.
No, that's good. That's just that's not a lot of fun, but that's great. And just keep this top of mind. You know, I love the reframing one because it gives you, you know, you want to go to Radical Candor, but like, what's your motivation? Because it's going to take work. So find a strength that really lives with you and feels, you know, like this makes me authentic to do it in this way. So, and then combining is just that old tool of how do I, you know, communicate better? How do I navigate a challenging situation or relationship better by leaning on a strength or pulling out the lesser strength? All right, so let's go to what some of those feedback tips. So now that we're talking about Radical Candor, we're going to give you a whole bunch of sort of tips and also some watch outs and some then real tools at the end. So these may seem obvious, but it's really important to reinforce them. So we just talked about share way more praise than we do criticism, as Phil talked about, that 5-to-1 ratio. Remember, you know, you can leave an end of year review and your boss has said all these wonderful things about you, and then yet it's one piece of criticism, and that's the thing that keeps you up all night long. That's fine, but you just need, you know, all year round, we have these opportunities to share praise, and we should find opportunities when somebody's doing something good, share praise. Seek out feedback. So that is that whole idea of really wanting it, right? Developing a thick skin. It's interesting because we were just talking about how do you receive the feedback with humility, right? You need to allow yourself to be vulnerable. You have to ask for it. And then when you get it, you have to receive it with grace. And that is so important because you also, if you listen, often the feedback that you get, if you take your emotion out of it, it's just like a little pinprick. It's just a little course correction. It's minor. And in our mind, if we let our negativity go out of control, it grows into something bigger. If we just listen to what it is and then realize it's just, oh, if I change that, then all of a sudden, that little change all of a sudden became, a big hug, a whole lot of praise, because now you're doing exactly what you should do. It is called learning. So accept that you should be on the learning curve, ask for feedback, and accept it with grace. Only I could. Okay, in person is best. Oh, those are the good old days, right? It was easier to do it where, you didn't really have an excuse to text or to email because sometimes you could do face-to-face. Nowadays, not so simple, although I would say Zoom is kind of sort of this face-to-face opportunity, and it's better than a texting. It's important. That's how you show personally. I would also warn that there's a challenge there, because there's a lot of unspoken feedback we're giving all the time that we don't realize. And Zoom's kind of is teaching us that we can look at ourselves all the time and you realize the body language, your sitting face expression, that's all feedback you're giving to someone. So make sure you're intentional about it. I know someone in our team realized, oh my God, look at my face. I look like, because she furrows her brow, I look like I'm critiquing everybody and I'm angry at everybody. That's just her squinting, right, to read the screen. Joe once said to me when we were in a meeting, he said, oh, I can see you didn't like that idea. And luckily he called me out on that because my expression had nothing to do with what he said. It was that I had gotten a little email had come in that had come out on my side of my screen that I was reacting to, like, oh. So we have to be careful with our body language and know that that's feedback too. In person is good, but we have to make sure that we are in person in these weird spaces now all the time. So be conscious of that, be intentional. One thing at a time. Overload, they're not going to hear it. It just becomes a whole lot of fuzz, like in the Charlie Brown cartoons. One thing at a time makes it manageable. Be timely. This is the whole, like, don't let it rot, right? Don't let it fester. It's like, my husband and I, we never, it seems so trite, but we never go to sleep angry because it will just blow. Then all of a sudden it piles up and eventually leads to a volcano because you are kind of shooting out that whole, like, not just that one incident, but 5 incidents. And then all that piles on and it's much bigger than it was. It's like an infection that spreads. Be timely. Nip it in the bud. That's the best way to do it. Be helpful. That's where I get to be creative, right? That's the creative strength that I use. So you can support somebody and understand the context, understand how they can change, what they can do, give ideas, let them. Mostly it's being an active listener and an active questioner. So be curious, bring up your curiosity and ask, like, why? What can I do to help? What drove you to that situation? So that's really important. These are just like our super tips, our greatest hits, we call them. And lastly, and we're going to dive a little bit more into this, is consider bias. So you need to really, this is, again, we've been talking about this before, it's stopping, right? And this is about understanding the context. We said, take the time to understand context. So identify any culture role that might be part of the feedback. So let's look at that a little bit more because it's an interesting topic and timely. So feedback, the way we give feedback, it's not top of mind necessarily, but it really is tied to our identity and our past experiences. So what do I mean by that? So first of all, think about it. It's our upbringing. Remember how we talked about that dinner table? Like some of us were raised in a dinner table that was full of zest and bombacity and loudness. That's just what we're used to. Maybe we grew up with a dinner table that was sedate and more prudent and very different. So the same thing about, if you grew up where your parents or your teachers talked about, if nothing nice to say, don't say anything, like the little bunny earlier on, right? Or honesty is the best policy, very different directives. Both of them make a lot of sense. Or we've been told as kids, which one is your driving force? Which one do you go to? Which one is most close to how you were raised? Cultural norms. It's fascinating. And these we forget to think about, but a lot of studies, especially now more than ever, have been done to understand the differences that we bring in a multicultural society. Just for instance, Harvard did a whole study on the feedback norms in Germany versus China. Okay, so in Germany, tough, critical, very to the point feedback is highly valued, and accomplishments are rarely celebrated. They're very serious folks. And these are generalizations, so I apologize for generalizations, but this was a study, and this is sort of just the general culture. That's what's built up. In China, in fact, differently, positive reinforcement is highly valued. And it's much more direct. And a critical approach is considered demotivating. So it's easy to see where care personally and challenge directly might look differently, depending on what part of the world you grew up in. Another one is implicit biases that we hold. And we talked about strengths biases. So for our team, for instance, we're all about creativity. All of us are high in creativity. So does that mean, our feedback might not be as linear or as clear as it needs to be? It might be more conceptual, or we may shy away from criticizing someone for their big ideas, when in fact, sometimes we have to rely on a prudent perspective, and we forget to do that. But we also tend to maybe give feedback differently to people, give feedback to people who are more like us in one way versus people who are different. So for instance, Harvard also did a study that they showed that women get less frequent and lower quality feedback than men. So you have to ask yourself, do you adjust the way you give feedback or even the way you receive feedback based on the identity of the person giving or receiving it? And, this might track back to your upbringing. So for instance, for me, it's as a woman leader, and this was years ago when I really started out, especially, my mother, she grew up, in sort of Depression era. She was a very passive woman and lovely in so many ways, but she never pushed back on my father or criticized anyone. That wasn't her place or her space. She got things done and she got her way, but she never spoke out. So my leadership style originally based on this sort of implicit bias that women shouldn't be aggressive in speaking out based on my upbringing was what I brought to work. And it helped me, it really forced me into that ruinous empathy quadrant, which is not where any of us want to be. So be aware of your implicit biases, how you might treat somebody who's more like you one way and who's less like you in a different way, and how you adjust it for different identities. And then the last thing to think about in terms of biases and identity is your past feedback experiences. So, you know, have you had a slew of horrible bosses that were really aggressive? Or did you come in from a loving, more nurturing service leadership environment? What was your first experience? What is your most recent experience? What is the dominant experience? Because that's most likely what's going to model how you act. So imagine if you came from an old school kind of world where yelling actually was valued. And a lot of times that was the way it was. And it wasn't emotional, it was just loud and aggressive. And now you come into a new world where that is not at all recognized at all. It's a much softer, kinder environment. That would be very, very disruptive and unhelpful to anyone. I know when I look at how, 30 years ago, my corporate experience versus my daughter right now in the corporate world, it's so different. The kind of environment she's in and leadership and feedback experiences she and I get. So it's interesting, be aware of that. So what we'd like you to do, having thought about all that, is we're going to break you back into rooms. And I think, what do we say? 2-person groups for about 6 minutes or so each. And what I'd like you to do is, based on all that, think about how your identity and background might impact the way in which you give and receive feedback. So is it how you were raised, your most recent leadership experience, some cultural biases, or I think I'm leaving one out, but I have to go back to the last page to understand. The cultural norms, upbringing, implicit biases, or past feedback experiences. So think about that. What if any of that has impacted your feedback style? How does that change? And how would you maybe adjust for that going forward so that you're more able to fall in the radical candor quadrant? Any questions before you break out? All right. Again, if you have any
last screen during the breakout.
Can you? So we can leave this screen up.
Yes. That would be great.
Good. Thank you. Great idea. All right, we're off. Thanks, guys. Some of the emotion and judgment and preconceptions that might come from what we just talked about, the bias. It's just called situation, SBI, we call it. So it's being very specific and as how you give your feedback. And it really does drive to different outcomes. And in fact, so you'll learn about it. There's I think a video and some other information on it. And then we're going to skim through this because we're going to go right to the assignment, which is going to be to practice SBI. So again, it's naming, what it really is naming the situation, talking about the behavior, and then describing the impact. And that's a way to give feedback so directly, so clearly, and in a caring context that it is heard and has impact. So what we'd like you to do is share some feedback with a colleague in the coming week, and then report back on your Schoology board. And we're so thrilled to see so many of you are using that board to give your comments, and you can interact with each other on that board as well. And a second bit of assignment, because next week is our last week, which is hard to believe, although we'll have an action planning group after that. But next week, we're really going to focus in for organization 2 in how we can spread and be champions in our organizations as leaders, whether we lead ourselves, whether we lead our reports, whether we're the CEO, whoever we are leaders, and we need to understand how to harness and activate our authentic leadership style. So you'll see there's a whole module on that, and it's kind of fun, and we'll be diving into that next week, and then really moving into action planning so that what Phil described, how we take it from the individual to the team to the organization, where you are spreading these tools, this mindset, this culture of strengths, so that people really get to hopefully live their best days every day, and then have better performance and better engagement and overall better well-being, which is really our core goal. So that's for next week. What, of course, we want you to do, that's next week. Everybody go vote. It'll be a different week next week, different times. And then we love you to share your feedback now, as we always ask. And as you can see, we really, really do take it to heart, and it helps us get better all the time. Continuous improvement is our motto. So please, either, if you can do it right now, that would be great. If we get it, you'll see an email later today with a reminder for it. So please fill in and evaluate us. You know what it is? We need feedback. So if you can be radically candid with us, that would be great. So thank you so much. Have a great week, great weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Great job. Thank you. I had fun.
Hi, Valerie. Nice to hear it. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Do we want to
That
leave
was
and come
smooth.
back, or you want to just do it now?
What's that?
I said, do you want to leave and come back, or do you want to jump into it now?
Sounds like maybe you'd like to do it right now.
That's what we did last week.
Yeah.
Why don't we stop the recording, and then we can.
Be radically candid.